Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Abby McClellan. I'm the Community Engagement Manager of United 10 Homelessness here at Orange County United Way. I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's community chat. We're so excited. I see a lot of people starting to log on. So I'll do a quick introduction while people are getting settled. But we are thank you everyone for joining us for today's chat. If you tuned in or missed last month's chat, we're talking about the continuum of care in Orange County, what a continuum of care is, what it does, what our continuum of care here in our community is wanting to do in the future. And so if that is of interest to you, if that's something you'd like to learn more about, that recording is up and available on our YouTube channel. And you should be able to find a link for that coming into the chat box here shortly. For this month, however, we are commemorating Fair Housing Month, since April is Fair Housing Month. And this month is taken to recognize this important topic because it is commemorating the 1968 passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act, which was really important legislation that prohibited discrimination in housing based on race, color, religion, or national origin. So today we have some wonderful speakers on board to help us learn more about these fair housing protections, what they look like today, what changes have happened since 1968, because I'm sure there has been, and talking about their relevancy to our community today, especially in regards to homelessness in Orange County. So I am thrilled to have, for our subject matter experts for this event, we're excited to have Richard Walker, the Supervising Attorney for Housing and Homelessness Prevention at the Public Law Center, and Brooke Weitzman, the Executive Director of the Elder Law and Disability Rights Center. So thank you both so much for joining us for today's event. Just as we're getting started, could you both introduce yourself and explain a bit about what you do in our community? So Brooke, I'll hand it over to you to get us started.
Sure. I'm, like you said, Brooke Weitzman with the Elder Law and Disability Rights Center. So we do a mix of free and low cost legal services focused on older adults and people with disabilities. And that could range from anything like helping individuals who are being exited from a homeless shelter to assert their right to due process and their disability accommodations to stay in the shelter, to helping folks who are in housing with issues with their landlord, to helping older adults do their end-of-life planning. And so kind of a wide range of services to move our community toward a place where everyone can live with independence and dignity.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brooke. And Richard, I'll ask you the same question. Can you introduce yourself and talk a bit about what you do?
Sure. So I'm Richard Walker, Supervising Attorney for the Housing and Homelessness Prevention Unit at the Public Law Center. The Public Law Center provides free legal services to low-income residents of Orange County. Specifically in the Housing and Homelessness Prevention Unit, we help with eviction defense. We help tenants who are having issues with their landlords, tenants who need reasonable accommodations. We also help tenants who are facing discrimination. And then we also do advocacy, and we do work around land use and public policy in the local communities, making sure that there's adequate planning for affordable housing, and that local ordinances and policies don't discriminate or exacerbate like patterns of segregation.
Thank you both for describing the work that you do, and we're so excited to have you both on the call. So to start this conversation really going, we talked about the Fair Housing Act. That's the reason why Fair Housing Month exists. But Brooke, could you tell us more about what the Fair Housing Act is and what does it do?
Sure. So the Fair Housing Act, at its core, its intent is to prohibit discrimination. It applies to housing, rentals, and sale. It applies to financing. And it does that by saying that people cannot, in housing, rental, sale, and financing, discriminate based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, or disability. So it kind of creates a list of protected classes and says landlords and owners who are interacting with these individuals for housing need to treat them all the same, can't pick out a group and treat it differently. Importantly, that means they can't refuse to sell or to rent to particular groups based on those protected categories. They can't say, hey, some residents in our complex get access to the pool and others don't. They can't limit the types of services. They can't give different rent based on race. So it really kind of listed out a lot of the types of actions that some landlords or homeowners would take to treat different groups differently, and said these protected groups have to be treated equally when it comes to housing. You can't deem a particular group undesirable and then harass them in the hopes they'll leave, because that also became a prohibited activity. It prohibited retaliation. So if a protected group were to organize or file a complaint or investigate, this act also said the other side, the financer or owner, could not retaliate for trying to determine if there had been a violation of this discriminatory act. And importantly, it created protections for people with disabilities. And so that piece meant that if people who are in housing or are applying to housing or getting financing need what's called a reasonable accommodation, which really just means kind of a adjustment to the policies or procedures that everyone else follows to ensure that they can interact with the housing in the same way everyone else can, that has to be done. So if a tenant is living on the second floor and develops a mobility limit and that building doesn't have an elevator, they might need to move to the first floor. And so those types of accommodation requests, things that are reasonable, have to be accommodated.
That's super helpful, Brooke. Thank you for giving that overview to help us really understand what we are talking about when we are talking about the Fair Housing Act. Richard, I'll now hand it over to you to talk about, Brooke really helped set the stage and talked a bit about it, but could you really help us dive into what has been the impact of the 1968 Fair Housing Act?
Sure. So the impact has been that it has provided an opportunity for those who have experienced discrimination, either in lending or purchasing a home or in renting an apartment, that they've had a way to resolve those issues. And so we've seen dozens of lawsuits filed against mortgage lenders for discriminatory policies or practices that have impacted these protected classes that are protected under the Fair Housing Act. We've seen all kinds of complaints submitted to the Department of Housing and Urban Development with regards to these discriminatory acts by landlords. And HUD gets involved in those and often can help resolve them, or there are subsequent lawsuits for that discriminatory act. So we have seen all kinds of lawsuits and complaints filed since then, and some of these issues are getting resolved. Unfortunately, we're still seeing these discriminatory issues. You'll still see in the news these days about real estate agents and how they treat their clients or treat prospective home buyers differently, or treat home sellers differently depending upon their race. So we're still seeing these issues. We're still seeing discrepancies in lending based upon race. And so these issues haven't gone away after the Fair Housing Act was passed. But at least at this point, we have the mechanism in order to resolve these issues as they continue to appear. And we're optimistic and hopeful that as we continue to improve these protections, that we're going to be able to continue to resolve these issues and prevent these discriminatory practices that we have seen historically. So there has been some improvement, but there's definitely still a work in progress here to completely resolve the discriminatory practices in housing.
Richard, that really leads us perfectly into the next question I was going to ask. Because some folks might have heard discussion because it came up in 2015, and I know that HUD is, I think January of this year, also announced some efforts about affirmatively furthering fair housing. So for folks who might not know what that really is, could you tell us more about what affirmatively furthering fair housing, what these efforts are, and what impact it could have, since you led us so perfectly from the previous response?
Definitely. So in the Fair Housing Act, there's the requirement that jurisdictions who are recipients of federal funding affirmatively further fair housing. And, historically, what that meant is that a jurisdiction simply had to say, yes, we affirmatively further fair housing. Maybe they printed out a certificate saying they affirmatively further fair housing and they posted that on the wall. And that was about the extent of what was required of them previously under the Fair Housing Act. And so all of these jurisdictions who are receiving funding from the federal government to help to improve housing conditions in the local communities, to provide assistance to local residents, they're supposed to, confirm that they're affirmatively furthering fair housing. Well, back in about 2015, kind of was looking at this and like, well, this isn't actually doing anything if all they're saying that they are affirmatively furthering fair housing, but nothing more is required of them. And so HUD began to develop regulations about what does it exactly mean to further fair housing and what more should be done than just to declare that you're affirmatively furthering fair housing. And so these new regulations are actually going to require jurisdictions to take proactive steps to make sure that they're combating segregation, that they're helping to improve and create more integrated communities, and that they're actually taking affirmative steps to remove any barriers that are preventing protected individuals and families from accessing housing. And so this is one of those ways that we're moving towards improving those protections and making sure that people are actually benefiting from the Fair Housing Act by making it more of jurisdictions actually have to go out and do something and can't just say, well, we don't discriminate, so we're all good. They have to actually improve the conditions for people in their communities.
That's super helpful and really good to know that those things are happening at that federal level. Since we have been talking a lot about the federal level, I know that there's some things that California has that California has the Fair Employment and Housing Act. And if I said that correctly, or if I said that incorrectly, please let me know, both of you. But I know that this month is usually focused very much on that federal level, but looking at it from the state perspective, could you tell us more about what is the Fair Employment and Housing Act and how does it, what is it in our state, and then how does it relate, if at all, to or connect to the Fair Housing and that Fair Housing Act at the federal level? So, Brooke, I'll hand it over to you first, and then Richard, I'll hand it back to you.
Sure. So yeah, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, often called FEHA, is the state law. And really what the state does is offers for residents of California similar but broader protections. So for example, in the federal level, it says you can't discriminate based on sex. That kind of implies gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, but it doesn't use those words. In California, those things, you cannot discriminate based on gender and gender identity. In California, you can't discriminate based on ancestry. So really just, and particularly when combined with the Unruh Civil Rights Act, really expands protections so that most classes of people are protected from discrimination. It makes that list much broader in terms of who's protected and how. And the probably biggest one that impacts folks who are often coming from homelessness into housing or people who rely on federal subsidies is in California. One of those protected groups is source of income. So they cannot discriminate based on where your money is coming from to pay rent, which means whether you're getting disability income, whether you have a subsidy that's paying part of your rent, whether you're working with a third party, that those things cannot be a reason to treat you differently in all the same ways that we talked about with the Fair Housing Act, based on access to, they can't limit access to resources, charge different rent, deny you entirely. So that's kind of the ways in which the state really expands on the protections.
That's super helpful. Richard, do you have anything else to add to Brooke's response?
I think Brooke really well covered FEHA and the protections that are under FEHA and that expansion. I just want to mention that FEHA is not the only California law that provides protections. Brooke hinted at the Unruh Civil Rights Act that provides some protections, and then also California kind of adopted the affirmatively fair housing rules already into their housing element laws. And so while it's been a little bit off on with the federal government implementing the affirmatively furthering fair housing rules and regulations, those were adopted by the state of California into housing element law. So there's already an obligation in California for jurisdictions to do more to affirmatively further fair housing.
Wow, that's super helpful to know. I didn't know about those other things as well, especially in regards to the housing element. That's really interesting. Then I guess that leads us perfectly, since we got to the federal level, talked about the state level. We're going to go even more down into Orange County. So I'd like to ask you both in regards to the Fair Housing Act or any of the other things you've mentioned in so far in this event. What do you see happening in our community, in Orange County specifically? And I'll leave that as broad so you all can take that in a way. But Richard, I'll hand it over to you to help us understand, well, what's going on in Orange County.
Yeah, so I'll touch on a little bit on the impact of people who are currently housed and the fair housing issues that they are facing. So we see all kinds of fair housing issues in Orange County. For example, we see a lot of times individuals who are undocumented, who aren't necessarily US citizens, experiencing housing discrimination. So there's being treated differently by landlords or management, or they're threatened by management or landlords. And often those communities are afraid to speak out, to reach out and get assistance. They don't realize that they have the same protections as any other resident or tenant would have. And in California, they have additional protections based on their immigration status that protect them from landlords taking negative actions against them or threatening to report them. And so we're often seeing those kinds of issues, and then just generally tenants who are not being treated the same as other residents because of these protected classes. So sometimes a manager might tell a family that your children can't play outside, or your children make too much noise, or a complex might implement rules that impact families with children because they're prohibiting behavior that's really typical of how children are expected to behave. And so those kinds of things are violations of the Fair Housing Act, right? You can't pass rules or regulations that are targeting families with children and having specific impacts on them. I think additionally, individuals with disabilities have extra protections as well and have the right to enjoy their housing just as anyone else who may not have a disability can enjoy their housing. And so they have rights to request modifications or accommodations in their housing to make sure that they can fully enjoy it. And so often it is a struggle to get landlords to agree to those accommodations or those modifications. And so those are some of the ways in which we're seeing fair housing laws not being followed, and individuals with disabilities being impacted by those actions.
Thank you, Richard. That was super helpful and really, really helpful to understand what you've seen and to have that understanding that how it is impacting people who are already housed, like you mentioned. So that's really helpful to understand what's happening in Orange County. And Brooke, I will hand it over to you for that same question. And I think, and thank you. I know that there was like a technical issue, but we're so happy to have you with us from a different camera angle. So Brooke, from your perspective, what are you seeing in Orange County in regards to what we've talked about already?
I think other than the moment that I got disconnected before I switched cameras, that Richard pretty much covered most of the things that we're seeing. It's primarily, particularly for folks who I'm working with more, who are often coming from being unhoused, often unhoused for a long time, seeking housing and running into discrimination in their applications. The biggest protected areas, those disability discriminations, they're not as overt and not as easy to prove that that is the intent when people have a service animal or a support animal. That when landlords in the current market are getting an abundance of applications, it creates a situation where they sometimes can choose to take one application over the other without directly saying they're discriminating because they don't want your service animal. The other area that we see that's really not protected by the FEHA or the Fair Housing Act that the state of California has been looking into is based on credit score, that often individuals who have the source of income protection, so they're not going to be discriminated against for having a housing subsidy like a voucher, do have a lower credit score. Sometimes that's because they have been living in poverty for many years and unable to meet their basic needs. And with that subsidy, their rent is determined based on their income. So the fact that they couldn't afford to meet their needs before doesn't indicate they can't pay their portion of the rent now. But the landlord still can say, hey, we've got a credit score that applies to everyone, and use that as kind of a pretext to discriminate based on the type of person they deem undesirable or targeting a particular otherwise protected group.
Thank you, Brooke. And I think you touched on it, but I would like to hear more about, you mentioned those disability accommodations. Could you dive more into, I know that in the prep for this, and you mentioned as well that disability accommodations can be an area where discrimination can happen. Can you talk more and sort of flesh that out just for folks who might not, just so folks really have that understanding of what you mean when you're referring to that?
Yeah, definitely. So we're talking about protections for disability accommodations that really can be anything that a person needs that's reasonable, to use the land the same way, to use the housing the same way that another person does. So for example, during COVID, we had an individual who couldn't go to sign the lease in person because she was in the hospital with COVID. And so the accommodation we asked that the landlord refused in violation of the Fair Housing Act and Fair Employment and Housing Act was to let her sign it remotely or delay the signing, right? To make it so that despite currently having a medical condition that prevented her from coming in, she could still access the unit. We often have individuals who may need an emotional support animal or a service animal. And landlords, particularly smaller landlords, sometimes don't understand that under those protections, those animals aren't pets, that they're actually a disability accommodation, that they're treated as a necessary thing for a disability and not the way that a pet would be treated. So these types of accommodations can range from anything from moving units to having notice be given in a different way for someone who has trouble with reading or writing, to having particular times or ways they can access things as simple as paying rent. So really is anything that's going to let a person who has a disability use their space in the same way as another person would.
And I can just add to that, you know, based on like a report that came out from the National Fair Housing Alliance back in 2017, just as the Fair Housing Act was completing 50 years, you know, they found that 57% of the complaints in 2017 were based on disability. So we're really seeing that that's like the primary situation in which people are facing discrimination, and that landlords are not accommodating people with disabilities. And that's where, you know, we're seeing most of the issue. And then we are seeing a growing issue in California now that they've added that source of income, and landlords can no longer discriminate against people who have Section 8 vouchers. We're starting to see it grow in those complaints and enforcement in that area, but there's still a lot that needs to be done with regards to both of those issues.
Thank you both so much. That was really helpful and really important information to highlight. With that being said, as we're getting sort of into the second part of our event today, if someone has experienced housing discrimination or knows someone who is, what should be their next steps, or what resources are available to them? Since I know that that is something that folks might be dealing with, especially after hearing both of you speak. So Brooke, I'll hand it over to you to hear your perspective of your response to that question.
Back on camera angle number one. So you know, I think there's a few options when people are experiencing discrimination or think they may be experiencing discrimination. One is filing complaints with the state and federal entities that oversee those laws we talked about. So the California Civil Rights Division and the Housing and Urban Development HUD both have processes by which you can file a complaint, potentially have someone investigate that complaint, and then if they agree with you that there's been a violation, they will sometimes take on the case and actually represent you in those cases. Another kind of more local option is to reach out to the legal services here in Orange County or in California, places like Richard's office, the Public Law Center, the Community Legal Aid of SoCal, the California Disability Rights Center, Disability Rights Center, which does kind of statewide California services. So looking at those places for folks who are in emergency shelters, our office helps anyone who's experiencing discrimination in those shelters that would violate the Fair Housing or FEHA Act, since those are also forms of housing. And so those individuals could contact our office directly. But really it's kind of looking at what are the resources and who might be able to help, and what are their self-help resources, and are those things that you have a way to assert, all of which is much easier to do when you're in the housing and seeking the assistance. Unfortunately, it's much harder when you're trying to get into housing.
Thank you, Brooke. And I noticed that your camera angle froze, but we could still hear you. So I think the Zoom participants still got the information you were sharing with us, but it was just frozen. Your video froze for a bit. So just wanted to let you know. And Richard, I'll hand it over to you to speak on that question as well.
Yeah, I think in addition to all of those things that Brooke mentioned about reaching out to, the state and federal agencies that handle fair housing complaints and reaching out to organizations like Public Law Center, Community Legal Aid, SoCal, Elder Law Disability Rights Center, and Disability Rights California. I think that something important is making sure that everything is documented. So making sure that when you're asking a landlord for a reasonable accommodation, that you're asking for that in writing and you're keeping a copy of everything you submit to the landlord and every response you get from the landlord in writings. You want to make sure that if there are communications that are verbal, that at somewhere you're writing down exactly what was said and potentially sending a follow-up letter or email to the landlord saying, hey, I just am sending this to confirm that this is what we discussed and this is what's going to happen. So as much as possible, make sure you're documenting everything that's going on, have additional witnesses anytime you're having those communications, or if there are communications that you think are like racist or otherwise violating fair housing laws, that you have other witnesses to that can help to build that case for the discrimination that you're experiencing. So when you reach out to a state or federal agency or one of our organizations, you'll have that support in order to take some enforcement action to resolve the issue.
Thank you, Richard. That's super insightful and very helpful. As we're winding down here, wanted to see, and I will, the next question I'm about to ask, Richard, I'll toss it to you first, just in case Brooke needs to get that camera angle 2 up again. But wanted to just hear from both of you, as you're thinking about the work that you're doing, about the work that you did over the past few years with COVID-19, how are you feeling about sort of the new changes that might be coming from that federal level, and with the things you were describing at the California state level? Is there anything that you're excited about that is happening that you think that could really impact the topic that we're talking about today? Anything that you think would be helpful, or anything that you think it's important for people to know as we wrap up here?
So I am definitely excited about the affirmatively furthering fair housing regulations at the federal level, and excited for those efforts at the state level to continue. It's all new. This is the adoption of those regulations into housing element law and other laws here in California. It's kind of just getting going right now, and so we've yet to see much happen in that area, and jurisdictions are just beginning to learn what they're supposed to be doing and figuring those things out. And so I'm excited to see where we go and see the actual changes happen from adopting those programs and policies, and seeing what happens, what comes from that enforcement of those regulations as we move forward in those directions.
Wonderful, thanks, Richard. And Brooke, I'll ask you the same question.
So I think we're really kind of hitting a point, for at least especially in California, where the people we've elected have no choice but to recognize that the housing crisis is a housing crisis, that people who are older adults are becoming homeless at record rates, that people are outliving their Social Security and they simply can't afford to live here, that the numbers of people living and dying in the streets of our state and our country are outrageous and growing. And so we're really looking at a place now where our legislatures are trying to figure out how to reconcile with that, how to support things like resolving the decades of discrimination in housing, right? How to support things like development at a rate at which we need to meet the housing need. And so I don't know if there's necessarily a specific bill other than, some of the things that come up every year, like right to housing, or, preventing those other discriminatory things like credit check, like the credit history when you have a subsidy. But then in the big picture, we're really at a unique place where our governments are, instead of looking at, the idea that maybe people don't want help or people don't deserve help, really taking a hard look at every level at how are they going to meet those affirmatively furthering fair housing goals? How are they going to meet the housing need? And how are they going to ensure that we aren't allowing our community to live or die in the streets instead of in housing? So I think there's a lot going on at kind of the state level, and it's a really good time for folks to get involved and to figure out how to push the community that you know, in their community and their electeds to really take steps toward long-term evidence-based solutions.
Well, thank you. That brings us right to 12:30. So that was perfect timing. Thank you both so much for being a part of this event and for sharing such wonderful information with us. And this brings us to the end of the event. Folks should be seeing an attendee feedback survey to pop up on their screens. So please fill that out to let us know, give us your feedback on what you liked about this event, how we could improve these types of events moving forward. And I just want to say thank you so much once again to Richard and Brooke for taking time out of your busy schedules to be a part of this event. And thank you to everyone who tuned in for also taking the time to learn with us, to really get an understanding of these protections and what they look like in our community. So really can't thank you all enough. And we look forward to seeing everyone next month. Thank you all.